So I'm Curtis Rhodes, and I'd like to open the presentation tonight. We're going to have a brief discussion on how computers have revolutionized music making. Two of the most important pioneers of computer music, Mathews and John Chowning, stand at the epicenter of this musical revolution. Research led by Mathews at Bell Laboratories, beginning in the 1950s, created a series of programming languages that are the direct precursors of today's software synthesizers. His many contributions to interactive music systems, algorithmic music composition, and psychoacoustics with Jean-Claude Risset are equally seminal. Stanford's legendary Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, or CCRMA, led by John Chowning, has long been a hotbed of innovation. After groundbreaking research in sound spatialization, John Chowning's invention of frequency modulation, or FM synthesis, led to the most successful synthesizer of all time, the Yamaha DX7. And with that, I'd like to introduce Max Mathews to begin the discussion of the beginnings of computer music.
Computer music was born in 1957. It was conceived at a concert of a local New Jersey pianist. I was working at Bell Laboratories at the time, and I had made equipment for putting voices digitizing voices and putting into a computer, and writing programs to simulate new telephones, and of course taking the voices out so you could hear them. John Pierce was my boss. We went to this concert, and the pianist, who will remain unnamed, played a little Schoenberg, which was very good, and a little Schnabel, which was very bad. And in the intermission, John and I turned to each other and said, "The computer can do better than this." And then John said, "Now, Max, take a little time from working on new telephones and write a computer music program." And so I said, yes. And I wrote Music 1. And you can see the waveform of Music 1 here, a very simple waveform. And the reason for this simplicity was that it was going to be computed by the world's a very fast computer, the IBM 704, which existed only on Madison Avenue, but was faced with a staggering number of computations to compute 10,000 samples per second of this sound wave. And the only thing it was really good at was addition, and this happens to be a wave that you can make by a sequence of additions. Then a brave audiologist, Newman Gutman, wrote the first piece for this. It's called In the Silver Scale. Silver is the name of a person, an audiologist, who invented a new scale, a slight modification of the equal tempered scale, so that all intervals have the same beat rate, and presumably then would sound better. But no one had heard it until the computer synthesized it, of course. So I will now play you this first piece. It lasts 17 seconds, and it is absolutely terrible. So now you can say you have heard the beginning. But before you can remember that piece, I want to play you a piece which was synthesized in about 1982 at institute set up in Paris called IRCAM, set up by Pierre Boulez. And in this piece, the computer is a soprano singing an aria from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. And the voice you hear is synthesized by the computer. The accompaniment is a real piano. Wrong piece. So, I think you'll agree that tremendous progress was made between 1957 and 1982. Now, the Queen of the Night sounded actually better than the technology should have made it sound. It was very carefully selected to be a vocalese piece, and it was synthesized with what's called a resonant synthesizer, which actually calculates the resonances of the human vocal tract, which are the essential parts. And this does a very good job on vowels, and vocalese has only vowels. It has no consonants, and consonants are much more difficult. But actually, there is an earlier example of synthesizing consonants, and this is called A Bicycle Built for Two, or Daisy Bell, that was synthesized in about 1962 by Carol Lochbaum and John Kelly at Bell Laboratories. And they used what's now very popular, what's called physical model to synthesize the human voice. And here's a sketch of the human vocal tract. And of course, you move your articulators, your tongue and your lips, to change the resonances of this vocal tract. And the physical model that was used to produce the singing here was called a tube model, where pulses of air go into the input of the model, and then the dimensions of the various sections of the tube model corresponding to the areas of the vocal tract are changed by the computer. And this particular example so intrigued Stanley Kubrick that he made this the swan song of the computer HAL in the movie 2001. So you've probably heard this before, but I'll play it again. So,
Daisy, give me your answer. I'm crazy, all for the love of you. It would be a stylish marriage. I can't afford a carriage, but you look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two.
So, although that has an accent, it's quite a pleasant accent, and it has plenty of consonances and is easy to understand. The crucial thing in the computing technology to be able to do speech and music was not the computer. If you waited long enough, almost any computer could produce the sound wave. The crucial element was the digital tape recorder, which IBM invented, which enabled you to collect the samples that the computer produced very slowly and then play them back at audio rates. And the thing that we made was a device which could take a computer tape and play it back on a Ampex audio tape recorder, read the data off of it, put it through a D-to-A converter, and get out the sound. So this is a picture of the first device there. The music program that you heard, Music 1 in '57, had only one voice and one timbre. Now, nobody was happy with that. So next year I made 4 voices and put in what's called wavetable synthesis, which means you can store a waveform of the sound in the computer memory and then read it out periodically. It still is an important synthesis technique. So that was a little better, but not much better. And people kept asking me to add something to the program. And I realized that if I dealt with their requests one at a time, I would spend the rest of my life doing it and not satisfying them. So Music 3 I consider the real breakthrough. Music 3 introduced the concept of unit generators to make music that were building blocks of sound, so that, for example, this is an oscillator, a simulated oscillator, but an oscillator where the both amplitude of the output and the duration and the frequency of the output could be controlled as input functions. So here we have an oscillator in which the frequency control consists of the sum of 3 quantities, and you will have a pitch, and then you'll have a periodic vibrato, and then you'll have a random vibrato put into the frequency control. And the amplitude control was another oscillator running very slowly to produce an attack and decay. Anyhow, this was a modular synthesis process where I gave to the musicians these blocks, and they could put them together in any way they wanted. And the inputs to the blocks came from a score which would play successive notes. So these concepts of block diagram computing and patching together an arbitrary collection of things and writing a score to play music were the essences of the musical synthesis, which are still used and valid today. Now, the first 4 programs were written in assembly language, and Music 5, the last one on the slide, was written in Fortran, a compiler language, and so it didn't have to be rewritten for each generation of computers. Now, at the beginning, after you'd heard the silver scale, probably you were all asking, why didn't we quit, give up then? And the answer is we had a mathematical theorem, the sampling theorem by Claude Shannon, which in musical domain and sound domain says that any sound that the human ear can hear can be constructed of the right sequence of digital samples. And that's, I mean, you can't say that about any other instrument. The violin is beautiful, I love it, but it always sounds like a violin. In fact, even an orchestra always sounds like an orchestra. I consider the orchestra the best instrument that exists today. So the next question that came up was how to get the right samples. Well, the computer provided a path to those examples in the hands of one person who is too far away to bring here today, Jean-Claude Risset, and John Chowning, who is here. And both of these people were attracted, seduced to working with the computer by this particular diagram, which was published in the Science magazine in 1963. Risset read this in Paris, where he was taking a degree in physics, and he persuaded his university to send him to Bell Labs for what turned out to be almost 3 years, working on his PhD at French expense in my laboratory, which was delightful. And he discovered many things about what kind of samples you have to sound as good as traditional instruments. And at that time, we knew that the spectrum of a sound, how much energy is at different frequencies, is the crucial quantity, is a crucial quantity that gives the difference between a violin and a trumpet and sound. But we were not able to, if we reproduced that spectrum with a computer, and we could do it, it did not sound like the instrument. What Risset primarily discovered was that the spectrum had to be slowly modulated to change this frequency distribution over the course of a note. But that if you did this, then you could get the same kind of expressive richness that traditional instruments had. Now, he first did this for the brass sound, the trumpet, and then he did it for many other instruments, and he made what he called a sound catalog. The sound catalog was a complete description of a sound. This is an example of his flute sound, and it contained a musical description so a musician could read it and understand it. It contained the Music 5 block diagram of the instrument, and it contained the score that produced the sound. And on a separate recording, it contained the sounds itself, so you could listen to them and form your own opinion. So I would next like to play some examples from the sound catalog. These are about 4 examples. The first one being brass sounds, the second one being a flute sound. I've forgotten what the last one is. Percussive sounds, and I've forgotten what the the third one was. But we'll hear them, and I'll tell you.
200. 100.
So, flute.
430.
Oh, bells. So now, the purpose of Risset's work was not to replace or imitate traditional instruments, but rather to get the same quality as one achieves in these instruments, but with sounds that are very different than instruments. And this is very well illustrated in what's called the computer suite for Little Boy. Little Boy was the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima by the Enola Gay plane. And the suite from it is, it was a play, a French play, and the suite illustrates the dropping of the bomb, and it starts out with fairly, as the bomber is approaching Hiroshima, with fairly traditional sounds, some of which you've heard before in the sound catalog. And then as the bomber passes over the release point, you hear a countdown, and the sounds become more and more strident and less instrumental, and finally a sort of a computer alarm clock as the bomb is released. So I'll start by playing those sounds to show you what Risset, an example of how I used this. These are excerpts from that from his piece, not the whole thing. Countdown. Release of the bomb. Now, the next section is perhaps one of the most interesting and surprising sounds that has been produced by the computer, and this is the falling of the bomb. And this is a glissando of descending pitch, which is endless. And this is an auditory illusion. The pitch actually doesn't descend continuously, but you just think it does. And this is because the computer is manipulating the spectrum at the same time it's manipulating the pitch of the sound, and I won't explain it further than that at this time. This continuous descent is punctuated by short sounds which actually do descend in pitch to contrast, but the overall effect is this continuous descent. Now, about halfway through the section, another sound is introduced. In this case, it is not a glissando going down, but rather it's a sequence of notes, each of which is lower in pitch than the predecessor. Again, an auditory illusion. To me, this represents death walking down beside the bomb. Now the second part. So I did not hear the descending steps on that. Maybe one of the channels was not playing, but anyhow, I don't intend to repeat it. Now, here is a picture of myself standing in an IBM 7094 computer in 1970, about 1965. Just to show you, a big room full of refrigerators. Here is a comparison of the power of the original computer, an IBM 704 running at 1/10 of a megahertz, had all of about 200,000 bytes of memory. Secondary memory in one tape was about 5 million bytes. It rented for $200 an hour, and it was a room full of equipment. This IBM ThinkPad that I'm presenting these things to you, I got in 2001. So its clock speed is about 8,000 times faster, and its RAM memory, I so much different I can't even do the multiplication. Second, memory, 20 gigs, and it costs to purchase $3,000 of 2,000 year dollars, and it weighs about 3 kilograms, so I can carry it around. Well, this is not news to anyone, but there's an enormous difference between what we had to do then and our resources now. The final picture here shows 4 of the people who have been closely involved in the development of the computers. John, who is here, I'm here, John Pierce, who died 3 or 4 years ago, and Jean-Claude, who is in Marseille. We're standing in front of the IRCAM PDP-10 in 1979. Now, in 1979, in my opinion, the PDP-10 was the only decent scientific computer in the world to use. There were a lot of commercial computers, but none of them for scientific purposes could rival the PDP-10. And so I was the scientific advisor to IRCAM at the time, and I persuaded IRCAM to get one of these computers. And this was possible and was facilitated by one person who was very important to the start of IRCAM, and this was Gordon Bell, who was a vice president of DEC at that time, and took a great deal of effort and pains to get IRCAM that computer. And Gordon, you're here tonight, and I would like to ask you to stand up and show the audience. And of course, this museum that we're in was founded, I guess, by Gordon's desire to collect old computer equipment, but by Gwen. Could you stand up, Gwen? And so. So the second person who read this science article was John Chowning, at the time a graduate student here at Stanford, and he came to visit me at Bell Labs, and in one day grasped the essence of computer music, went back to Stanford, and very soon programmed his own music program, which then was very popular and led to many things, including Karma and FM synthesis. So, John?
Thank you, Max. So, Max has done many things for many people, and he continues to do many things for many people, and not the least of whom is me. And I must say that in 1964, when I saw my first computer as a 2-year-old graduate student at Stanford studying music composition, and after having read Max's famous article, I was a most unlikely person to ever. I still don't know how to solder, and there are few at my age who don't know how to solder, but Max was one of the really important people in those early years. He was the source of the program and the accessible concept, and I must emphasize the way one formulates these ideas turns out to be extraordinarily important. There were other people later who developed music synthesis programs, but one had to be a pretty knowledgeable person in mathematics to be able to make sense of them. the idea of the module and having an understanding of these processes which could be comprehended in their isolated simplicity and develop complexity out of putting all these together as one learned each element of the process was what allowed all of us who were essentially musicians by training to gain access to this formidable medium. So Max was my distant mentor until some years later, when I think one of the best things I ever did at CCRMA was, while I was at Stanford, was getting Stanford to hire Max, come to join our faculty. So that was a great achievement. The other person, I must say, who was kind of part of my personal serendipity was Leland Smith, who was with whom I came to study music at Stanford, and who had no interest in electronic music or computer music. I had an interest from my previous years in Paris, where there was a lot of activity. And so Leland not only encouraged me to pursue this, but he joined me a couple of years later, and he and I developed one of these wonderful complementary relationships. My interest at that time in the acoustic aspect of computer music, kind of the sound stuff. Music was, of course, represented by notation, and Leland's interest in the music representation and my work formed the perfect complement. And he wrote a program, Score, which I used in my early pieces, and now which was transformed by Leland over the years and has now become the publishing tool of choice in all the major publishers in the world. So Leland was one of these unlikely people in the music world who mostly feared computers, and some I guess still do. And I think Leland's here tonight, and I'd like to thank him at this opportunity. Leland? Yes. So most all the music that's well published that you see today is thanks to Leland, and that was an absolutely individual project. The other person that was absolutely essential and taught me everything I know about computers is David Poole, who was one of the population of, for me, geniuses, and probably for many of you at the AI lab, a lab of people which was the kind of sum total of whom I could approach many, many times to find the answers to questions that I asked many, many times and finally get an answer that I could understand. But what a place it was, and what a person David Poole was. Now, I met David because he played tuba in the orchestra, not just tuba, but he played it very well. I played timpani in the Stanford Orchestra. He was an undergraduate, I was a graduate student, and this article was passed to me by some random person that Max had published, and I read it and contacted Max, got the cards, went to the AI lab, which was then a PDP-1 and about 3 terminals, one of the early timeshare systems. And I met Dave Poole, and he took this project, and he got the Bell FAP compiler to run on the IBM 7090, got the music program to run, did the buffering between the IBM 2314 disk, I think, and the PDP-1 so that we could do sound transfer and use the Dexscope XY converters as our channel A and channel B. So we had a stereo system online. Astonishing person. He taught me everything that I needed to know. I was already 30 years old, and my last math class had been in some many years before. And I think without David, I would never have been able to make the life that I've been able to live. David, we lost in a sailing accident several years ago. The other person, I must say, is Les Ernest, who also is here, who protected me from the well-funded AI lab with whom I competed. We worked at night and early mornings, and Les allowed us to do this. And when we were sometimes under attack by administration, whatnot, Les would hold them back and insist that computer music continue at the AI lab. So Les also is here, although I think he's having trouble walking because he fell off his bicycle. But these are 4 people, and Les, there's Les. Yeah. So in those years, what was foreseen? Well, Max already imagined the personal computer, object-oriented programming. Max's representation, which he's already spoken about, was extraordinarily important and persists to this day. Artificial intelligence, maybe ultimately not all that successful, but wow, what a great bunch of interesting people it attracted because the problems were so difficult. And then creating music using computers. And this is the quote from the article that Max wrote there in Science, published in, I think, November 1963. This is the article that I read, and the statement that kind of got my attention. There are no theoretical limitations to the performance of the computer as a source of musical sounds, in contrast to the performance of ordinary instruments. Wow. I mean, I was a composer, and the thought that given loudspeakers as the ultimate sound source, and knowing even then that the recordings that were pretty well done of traditional music, if one can do any conceivable sound by means of computer, is for a composer that was enormously attractive. He continued, the range of computer music is limited principally by cost and by our knowledge of psychoacoustics. These limits are rapidly receding. Psychoacoustics turns out to be one of the most important of the areas probably unanticipated in the evolution of computer music. Physical modeling was well understood, but I think how complex it turns out to be in rendering natural quality musical tones that can be tested against matches with real ones, showed that to be a lot more difficult than ever was thought of. And I think nonlinear synthesis was probably not imagined, and my own naive discovery of FM synthesis, which indeed was naive. I had no reason at all to be playing with this computer and creating these extreme vibratos, and even having been a violinist and knowing that vibrato has these physical limits, I had this trepidation when I first started making these sinusoids wander up faster and faster at greater and greater vibrato depths, deviation. And then some of the work that, for example, Curtis did in granular synthesis and other nonlinear techniques, I think these were not seen, and they were thought in the initial stages to be novel, but we later realized they could, in some cases, turn out to be extraordinarily powerful perceptual models. And then Max's support of psychoacoustics, and as he's mentioned, Jean-Claude's work and with Max at Bell Labs, was absolutely key to my broadened understanding of the potential of frequency modulation synthesis. The essential realization, as Max has explained, is that the inner dynamic motion of the harmonic energy during the rapid evolution during attacks or the application of a force, whether it's bow force or strike force, and on the piano, strike force in a percussion instrument, or bow velocity attack. All these turned out to have very, very great importance. I have a little example that shows how this works. As the attack, as pressure is applied in the bell or the mouthpiece of a brass instrument, there's a rapid change in the centroid of the spectrum. Let me do that again. And then as the force, that is the air pressure diminishes, so does the spectrum, or the bandwidth of the spectrum diminish as well. Now, based upon that example, or that knowledge, I made, are we plugged in? Yeah. So we should get some sound.
Let's see, I got sound, all right. Yeah, that's plugged in.
Is it in the right plug?
Okay, just one moment. Well, there we are. But we need more level.
I think it's the next plug jack over.
Here.
Oh, yes, you're right. So that's my fault. I plugged it into the wrong hole.
Hey, pull down the volumes, please. Oh!
First one, yeah. Echo.
Okay, well, let's try that again. Okay, well, that's an example of brass-like tones that I did, a little canon that I wrote to demonstrate this effect. The idea was I could very simply couple the modulation index and the amplitude envelope together such that as one grows, so does the other. And it turned out to be, at least for the time, startlingly good brass-like tones, and transformable, as we hear in the mid-range and then the low range. Well, everyone who worked at the AI lab has heard these examples many times. And so for them, this is a bit of a nostalgia. So now Risset's observation about what happens in the microstructure of a brass tone, of course, is extended to all the natural instruments, that is this relationship of force, input force, and the centroid and bandwidth of the spectrum that results. And in the case of a bell, we can hear this. And in this case, by coupling the amplitude envelope and the modulation index together, we have a decrease or an exponential decay in the amplitude, and the spectrum becomes ever more simple and the bandwidth therefore reduced at the same time. Until at the very threshold we hear just what's called the hum tone, that tone which persists. Now, when one looks at all these spectral components, and this is just, this is not it's not a representation of the actual, there are many more. In the techniques that were used at that time, it would have demanded a separate oscillator modulator pair for each of those components. And the fact that I could use the same simple little circuit that Max projected up a while ago, that which was used with a vibrato and simple tone, I could make these tones as well as brass tones and clarinet tones. Turned out to be a pretty major breakthrough, given the fact that the computational expense of music synthesis was enormous. There were inherent problems which, in realizing devices that could be based on digital synthesis, that had to do with aliasing. That is, that the signal had to be band limited. And frequency modulation synthesis turned out to be, provide a simple solution to that, in that the modulation index could be scaled to frequency. That is, as pitch height increased, then the modulation could be scaled. And it's a simple parameter, so it allowed the conception of musical devices that didn't have to deal with special complex filtering, which at that time was not very inexpensive, I must say. So this was the simple algorithm that was used. The complexity was inherent in the nature of frequency modulation itself. The fact that Bessel functions are involved, of course, are not computed. That's the way we describe the effect, or what is used to describe the effect of the simple modulation. Here's an example that shows a tone with some 4 or 5 harmonics as it evolves in time from a modulation index of 0 to 4, and how the Bessel coefficients affect the okay, once more. So that this is done with 2 oscillators, I realized, and that this being an absolute oral discovery, I understood intuitively that this certainly had some wide applications, which of course it finally did, as Curtis mentioned. The Yamaha Corporation made good use of this. Now, this is a set of Bessel functions. I include that simply because it's such a beautiful representation of the set. But the focus that I'd like to bring to the rest of what I have to say before I play a piece has to do with the importance of perception and our understanding how the auditory system works and what it turns out to be important in acoustic signals to our perception of sounds. In some sense, one might say this has to do with sensory aesthetics, that is, that aspect of what we think interesting or beautiful, which is at a very low level of processing, that is, at the level where we reject or we accept tones. The example that I'd like to play is a synthetic soprano tone in which we've deconstructed the tone into its fundamental, which we hear first. Then it's joined by all the harmonics that would be present for some given vowel, in this case, I guess, kind of an ah vowel, at which point we do not recognize this as being a sung soprano tone. It's not until I add this mix of vibrato, both periodic or quasi-periodic vibrato, which is a mix of periodic vibrato and random vibrato, where we have this motion in the temporal domain that we hear this example as being that of a sung soprano tone. So I'll play it twice through, but first a pure sinusoid with the fundamental pitch. Doesn't fuse, we hear the parts. It's not a soprano. And now, magically, with this one attribute, this micro-modulation, the components cohere, we identify the source, and it is a soprano. So once more. Now, if we put 3 together and present the same example, now not with just one soprano, but with 3, one at 400 hertz, one at 500 hertz, and one at 600 hertz, which of course forms a pure triad. What will we hear? Well, we'll hear 3 tones that do not sound like three sopranos singing until that moment in the transformation where each group of harmonics has its own independent micro-modulatory pattern. So there's a visual analog to this, and as there is to many of the phenomena having to do with audition. And this one has to do with common fate, the Gestalt principle of grouping. And I want you to look for these three singers in the next image using your ears. They're there, but perhaps you don't see them. Once more. So, three sinusoids to which we add all the harmonics. Then we segregate the sources. So this micromodulation is important in both source identification, that is, what source is it, but it's also important in our ability to segregate sources in complex acoustic environments. And music, of course, is perhaps the only auditory task in which simultaneous sources has to do with the intrinsic richness of the stuff itself. That is, in all other auditory tasks, like conversations, the cocktail party effect, we focus on a conversation and try to exclude others as noise. Maybe submarine sonar tests are interested also in simultaneous sources, but in our normal life, music is where we find this to be most important. Well, based upon our ability to control with a computer these kind of details, this microstructure of sound, I composed a piece that I'll play part of for you in a moment. The idea is, in this example, where I manipulate the perception of that which you hear based upon familiarity with struck bell-like tones or vibraphone-like tones, the fact that we recognize a soprano tone or a singing vocal tone based upon the correct spectrum, but also this micromodulation. So in this example, at the outset, we hear a struck metal bar, which decays as metal bars do, but then begins to grow again, and as it does, it acquires the harmonics that are here represented as a shading in the hue that would be associated with a sung vocal tone. And I put a bunch of these together, so we have the following example of an unlikely transformation of sung vocal or bell-like tone, which is transformed into soprani, rather beautiful sopranos, I must say, and then once more into a metal bar. So this is the example. Clearly a metallophone. But now sung voices. The micromodulation fades away and we're left with the tail end of a decaying metal bar. Now, that's a kind of play upon nature using computers, or these natural sounds with these unlikely links. The next example, before I play the piece, is an extrapolation of that which we all know and love, the instrument of instruments, which is the singing voice. In this case, I've taken a typical sort of male voice spectrum, and I've added energy added harmonics down below that which any male voice could sing, and at an intensity that is simply not possible. So this would be that sound which might be made by a basso, maybe 10 or 20 feet tall, with a resonance system, like with resonances that are an octave or two below, so a huge, huge head and a long, long throat between the vocal folds. And so the an enormous large vocal tract And here's the example of what I call a basso profundissimo. Okay, so now we all know that Tibetan monks can sing these very low tones, and they're even great Russian basses, but none of them can sing that low with the kind of loudness, the bigness of sound that you heard in this example. So I'm going to play a piece Phonea, but before I do it, there's one little example that I want to play because in Phonea there's lots of spatial motion. This is a 4-channel piece, and one of the early interests and my earliest work was in the issue of sound localization, trying to create illusions of sounds at varying distances and angles relative to the listener using not only a finite but a small number of loudspeakers as actual sources. So it's the virtual source issue. So these are some examples from my early work, maybe this is 1968. Sound moving from left to right or right to left. All right, so this was all done using one of the initial early drawing devices at first, and then I computed these tracks at the AI lab. And people like Bruce Baumgard, who is here, and others helped me figure out how to compute this based upon plotting points on a scope, using radial velocity being the difference in differences between the radii of successive points, and the angular velocity based upon the angular displacement. So Phonea was realized beginning 1979, 80, and 81, and it's the first piece that I did using our beloved Samson box, which was the largest, probably most complete all digital synthesizer that had ever been designed and built for us by Systems Concepts by Peter Sampson, who is one of your members and here, and Peter, thanks ever so much. So this is not a re-realization of Phonea. These are the actual samples from the Samson box that, as they were computed in 1989. Okay, let me see. So, in the interests of time, I'm going to stop it here, but encourage you to pick this up. It's Vergo record company, and it's a great stocking stuffer. And
It's holiday season.
yeah, and I guess I don't want to miss the opportunity to thank the museum for this and their wonderful staff for this, from all of us. So I'll turn it over to Curtis.
Thank you, John. We'll come back to some of the points you made a little later. I think all of us here on the panel want to thank John Toole, Stephen Brewster, Karen Tucker, and Pam Cleveland of the Computer History Museum here, and also 01, the Art and Technology Network, who are sponsoring this event, as well as the other sponsors. I want to proceed very quickly to talk just a little bit about some of the work that I've done in the past, and then maybe show it very briefly before we go on to a panel discussion, and then solicit questions from the audience about the history of computer music in particular. My own history...
Chryssie.
Yes?
Chryssie.
Piano performance.
Oh, okay, that's correct. Sorry, I'm interrupting the performance. We're going to have a piano performance now, then I'm going to come back and do my thing. I get distracted by the screen change. Sorry. Max, would you like to make the announcement?
Oh, this is my pleasure. So I'd like to introduce Chryssie Nanou, who will play the piece, a duet for one pianist, written by Jean-Claude Risset. And the second performer on the piano is the Macintosh computer that you see Chryssie bringing up now. That piano she's playing is a Yamaha disc clavier, and it's instrumented each key with a sensor that sends to the computer a trigger when the key is pressed and an indication of how hard it's pressed. And in addition, there are solenoids under each key so that the computer can play keys on the piano, and the program for the computer written by Jean-Claude Risset, as well as the musical score which Chryssie is playing from, causes the computer to respond to the notes that Chryssie plays in a very musical and complex way. Now, there are 8 sections to the performance, and each section has a different structure of computer response. The whole composition is 10 minutes long. Going back to Chryssie's background, she was born in Greece and was a child prodigy on the piano. She went to Paris to get her performance degree in music. Then she came to the Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins in the United States to take graduate work in the piano, and caused Johns Hopkins to introduce a new performance piano degree, piano plus computer. And leaving Johns Hopkins, we're very fortunate that she is and still is a visiting scholar at CCRMA. So Chryssie can play anything on the piano, but she specializes in early 21st century compositions. So, Chryssie Nanou in Jean-Claude's piece, Duet for One Pianist. And you will see the keys being pressed on the screen. We've set it up especially for that. so you can tell which keys the computer is pressing.
Chryssie Nanou, an amazing performer. And I'm so glad that she's decided to join John, Max, and myself for our next performance of a laptop trio with piano accompaniment. For the next time we come back, we're rehearsing for that. That's why I got a little nervous and switched things around. So I'd like to maybe conclude with a couple remarks on some of my own work, and then we'll switch to the question and answer session. And I definitely have a question about that piece as well that I want to ask. I've been working with the computer since around 1971, 72, working with electronic music a little before that. And one of the first ideas that I had was to try to implement a theory of one of my teachers, Yanis Xenakis, which was to synthesize sound particles. And this comes from a theory of the Nobel Prize winning physicist Denis Gabor that said that all sound could be considered as being made up of elementary sound particles limited in time, frequency, and amplitude. So in 1974, I wrote a computer program, and I have to say that the program that I used as an enabling program to make this first experiment was Music 5 of Max Mathews. And I would not have gotten into this field had I not had the support of certain mentors who had already established themselves. In particular, I remember a very important visit in my life in 1972 to the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford, and getting a tour of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory and the Computer Music Facility at Stanford by none other than John Chowning, and that had a huge impact on me as a 19-year-old hippie musician who didn't really know how to use these computers at that time. So I began in 1974, but unlike Max, I try to keep some of these old experiments a little bit hidden. They're kind of embarrassing. So I'd like to skip to the newer stuff more quickly. But I would like to say that we've created a website. If you're interested in the history of electronic and computer music, I'd recommend a website that we created for a course that I teach at University of California, Santa Barbara. The URL is here, and it has dozens and dozens of links to all kinds of information on early computers and their use in synthesizing music, creating music of all different types. And one of the pages, if I see a couple people writing, but www.mat.ucsb.edu/276n, and one of the pages, for example, is concerning someone that you might recognize from this panel on the history of computer music, with a link down here to the Computer History Museum itself. I think rather than go into much theory about this granular type of synthesis, it produces very small particles of sound that range between 1/1000th of a second, or 1 millisecond, and 1/10th of a second, or 100 milliseconds. And then we generate hundreds or thousands of these to create different types of sounds. And as I say, this is a completely general technique. It can be used to synthesize any type of sound. And in fact, I would claim that the sound that Max played earlier of the soprano singing the aria from The Queen of the Night was produced with particle synthesis, a technique called Pfaff synthesis, which is very similar to a technique I've developed called Pulsar synthesis. I don't think that I'll demonstrate that, though, today. I think I want to move forward and just play a couple of recent music videos that we've created that are from a new DVD called Point Line Cloud that should be coming out at about 9 a.m. tomorrow from a record label called Asphodel in San Francisco. These were all created with, I'm going to play two short pieces created with these particle synthesis techniques, and you can see in the first, it creates cloud-like or liquid-like swarms of sound that I'm controlling very carefully really on a particle by particle basis finally in the editing. And then in the second piece, it's more of a traditional musical style of variations on a theme, very pitch-oriented, but again composed very much on this micro-time level. I've written a book about these techniques called Microsound, published by MIT Press, and I'm currently working on a book on electronic music composition, but I don't expect to finish that for quite a while. Okay, we've switched to the DVD. So without further ado, I'd like to play the first piece, which is called Sculptor. I would like to mention that the visuals are by a brilliant young San Francisco-based artist named Brian O'Reilly. I have something here. I don't have a photograph of Brian, but I got something today that will give you an idea what he looks like. This is a action figure that someone has made called Fuzz, and Brian looks pretty much like this. This is his Christmas present. He doesn't know it. I don't think he's here today, I hope. You might want to ask me afterward, how were these videos made? And I will tell you that they are very tightly synchronized to the audio by means of programs like Final Cut Pro, and in some cases he uses VJ programs. But in general, the short answer is, I don't know. That's his job. I composed the music first, and then he made the videos afterward. So we'll play Sculptor, one of these pieces in Point Line Cloud. And if we could dim the front lights here. Normally this is in color, so I guess we've lost the color part. The second piece I'm going to play is called Pictor Alpha, and it is made with the same type of techniques, but this time I'm lining up the particles very closely in succession so that they form pitched tones. So each of the pitches in this piece is made by taking a single sound particle, replicating it on an audio time scale to create a pitched tone. Pictor alpha. Thank you. Thank you. So with that, I think I'd like to begin our panel discussion a little bit, have a couple questions, and then open it up to the audience. Maybe I could ask, since you're here available to me, John, I've always wondered about this story of a PDP-10 computer supposedly being proposed to be put on stage at Boston Symphony Hall. Is there any truth in that story?
Yes, there was such a project, and I think we're lucky probably that it didn't happen because there was nothing that was, at that time, I think, certainly in a research environment the sort that we lived in, there was nothing that was stable enough to survive a performance with a major orchestra. But we did have discussions with Seiji Ozawa and Lauren Rush, John Gray, Andy Moore, and I. We worked this project for, I'd say, some months. And it was stimulating thought and fundamentally not practical. But we met Seiji Ozawa, and he's a pretty fine person.
Yes. Max, you were developing this modular unit generator concept, the idea of taking individual modules and putting them together to create sound synthesis in the early 60s. And as I recall, somewhat contemporaneous with that, there was another type of modular system being developed using a completely different type of technology, which was the Moog synthesizer, developed by Robert Moog, of course, which was analog. Can you tell us a little bit about that period, and did you two influence each other, or was it really more of an independent development?
Well, no, modular synthesis was a zeitgeist of the time, and both Moog and Buchla and myself, all three of us, proceeded independently in two different media, and came out, I think, with systems that were very popular because the musician could then construct his own instruments from them.
And that software, by the way, in case some of you don't know it, this Music N software is still the focus today. It is the model established for the creation of computer music synthesis algorithms to this day. Max, I wanted to ask you about some of the famous musicians that toured your facilities at Bell Telephone Laboratories, and what was the reaction of the musicians in the 1950s and the 1960s to this type of technology?
Well, the ones that came around to see us were very, very encouraging and supportive, even though the sounds we could play for them were very poor. But they saw the future in this. Ustichevsky at Columbia University and Milton Babbitt at Princeton University, and Edgar Varese, a composer in Greenwich Village, had enormous respect for acoustics and audio technology. Varese, for example, was a charter member of the Acoustical Society.
Yes, I didn't know that.
Mostly a bunch of physicists, but he was there. So those are just a few to mention at the beginning, but there are many others, in addition to Risset and Chowning.
Yes. And John, you played host to some pretty famous musicians at the CCRMA Center.
Well, we have. Of course, Pierre Boulez, and he was prime conductor of the New York Philharmonic, the London, or the BBC Orchestra, and founder of IRCOM. Visited with the whole crew, and we gave them a summer course. I must say, Boulez, of all the musicians in the classical music world of that stature, was the most adventurous and I think thoughtful about new directions. He essentially abandoned, shortly after he met Max, the idea of building analog synthesizers and went altogether digital. Quincy Jones visited us maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago.
That's one I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, it turns out that Quincy Jones studied with Nadia Boulanger, and we overlapped, although we never met, surprisingly, in 1959. He is a wonderfully educated person, and perhaps that's obvious, but Brian Eno.
Brian Eno.
Is a great user of the DX7, maybe still the first DX7, because it had a special quality which he has tied his music to. And I would say those are the two that come to mind.
Yes.
Curtis, don't you think we should open the discussion?
Yeah, perhaps
the audience
absolutely.
questions.
A couple of questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
If anybody has questions, they can step up to the microphone here.
Run a little bit late, but we'll try to get a few of these in.
Thank you. Hi, Michael Good from musicxml.com. I was wondering when you got the idea that computer music would become so pervasive in popular music, in music production? Was it when the DX7 was about to come out? Was it 20 years earlier? Was it later? I mean, it's all around. It's just totally pervasive in pop music production. And I was wondering when you got the idea that that was going to happen.
It wasn't an idea. Chowning made it happen, Chowning and the Yamaha company. They reduced the entry price from buying a DEC system for $100,000 down to buying a DX7 for $2,000. It's a 50-to-1 reduction in price, and my estimate is that there was about a 5,000-to-1 increase in the number of people doing this.
Perhaps just a quick aside, the driving force for FM synthesis, of course, was the art music that we were doing, and never anticipated that it would become so widely used. And I'll tell you the maybe not so satisfying is the fact that the most pervasive use of FM synthesis is probably in your pocket right now. The little beeps and bloops that you have on your cell phones.
Yeah. Another question.
Thanks a lot for that. I'm Steve Liebson, and my question is about the future. Early on, you were trying to reproduce sounds of musical instruments, and we now see that you've done a really good job of doing that, and now we've developed sounds that no musical instrument can play, as we've just had a demonstration, and we have a demonstration of if you will, a robotic accompanist, or a four-handed pianist, if you will. So we've created new types of musicians and new types of sounds. I'd like you to go beyond that and give us your visions of where future music is going to with computing.
Well, I've just come back from a round table in New York of us oldies who knew where electronic music came from, but didn't have any idea about where it's going to. But one brave musician, John Appleton, said, well, it's hard to predict the future, but I'm going to do it anyhow. And I think he's been reading these articles about brain scans and different parts of the brain that get the pleasure center from listening to Beethoven symphonies and such. And he thinks that we'll make an electronic helmet that you'll wear, which will stimulate your brain to generate the music inside your head.
The problem is, I think, that we all like to play, or many of us like to play, and so this computer music isn't a question of efficiency, it's an art. People like Chryssie spend thousands of hours learning to manipulate these keys, not just for this music, but Chopin, Beethoven, the whole history of music, with all the repertoire. So people like to play, and they'll always play, I think. So computer interaction with people who perform is certainly one of its futures.
Terrific. Last question, please.
I wanted to comment that some of the sounds I heard tonight, the mass public had been exposed to them in the soundtrack of Andromeda Strain. I wanted to know if you knew the composer who did that. It sounds very similar to what we saw here.
I don't.
Does anyone here know?
Does anyone know? Great question.
Maurice Jarre, very good composer. Not his son.
Well, Curtis, with that, I'd like to call it to a close. I know they'll be around for extra questions, but thank you all for coming. Have a great holiday. And let's give this terrific panel a well round of applause.